Hello, and welcome to Hospice Insights, the Law and Beyond, where we connect you to what matters in the ever-changing world of hospice and palliative care. Check the mail. Are you getting a 4% rate cut? Jake Harris, here you are yet again for I think we were counting before the podcast began. This is the fourth year we've been on this cycle of having conversations around this time of year.
It is. It's certainly that time of year, midsummer, when those dreaded letters come in. And thankfully, as we'll discuss in a little bit, we've got a lot of experience dealing with them.
Yeah, it's like a mosquito, like the mosquitoes swarm in July. I got mosquitoes on the mind because it is wet and hot and humid here in Little Old, Wisconsin, which is also where you happen to be, Jake, too. So
that's right.
So mosquitoes come, these HIS cap non-compliance letters come the same time. And obviously, what was it last year? They increased the penalty to 4%, and it was previously 2%. And so this really does have, most people are running pretty small margins. And so if you're going to add, a rate cut, it's pretty significant. And I think that a lot of people probably were like, I never have to deal with one of these non-compliance letters. And then it's like, well, let's introduce you to Jake, because Jake, I don't know how many we've dealt with over the last 4 years. And a lot, they were all like good providers that for a whole variety of different reasons. Obviously, COVID played early on in these appeals in the first year or two. But a lot of good providers sometimes get these letters too, because you could have had some snafu with goodness knows what. So yeah, absolutely. That timeliness requirement is relentless, right? Where it's within 30 days of the event date, that quality data needs to not only be reported or submitted to the government, but also the data needs to be successfully accepted, which oftentimes there are technical difficulties that prevent that from happening in a timely manner. And the system is fairly automated in terms of if you don't have 90% of the data reported within 30 days of the event date during the applicable calendar year, you will receive one of these letters. And I think the first step, Meg, is really to make sure that you're on the lookout for the letter itself. Because that could come in one of two ways. It could come in the mail, or it could come in your Casper folder. So throughout the month of July and probably into August, to be safe, providers will want to be checking the Casper folder, checking their mail to make sure that there is not one of these letters in there. Because unfortunately, one defense that never works is to say, well, we didn't receive the letter. Yeah, exactly. That generally does not work. And then you're like proving a negative, like, well, but I didn't get it. And that gets to be very testy. And I think that even people who think like, oh, yeah, I'm compliant, my internal records show I'm fine. You still should look in these places, because you said something really important, is it needs to be successfully transmitted. And in the years of working on these appeals, people thought they successfully transmitted things that for whatever reason did not. And so anyway, there can just, people might be expecting these letters. They also could perhaps not be expecting them. And then, because maybe this isn't the case any longer, but a lot of people didn't know like how to find this in their Casper file and stuff. I know you've had to walk through with a number of clients, like where to look for stuff. And people are like, I never go there.
Sure. And, particularly depending on where you maintain your business address, and where people may or may not have been working during the pandemic, right? There's a lot more remote work. Things would get lost in the mail with a lot more frequency than maybe what we saw 5 or 10 years ago. So be checking in person, be checking electronically, again, throughout the month of July. And, if you get one of these letters, you want to catch it early because the reconsideration period typically closes sometime in mid-August. And we'll want to have time, whether we're working with you or whether you're doing it yourself, to prepare a reconsideration request that gives you the best chance of reversing this 4% penalty.
Yeah. So I think that we, prior to 4 years ago, I think I worked on like one or two of these. And then now we've worked on countless to great success. And I think to, you know, lawyers don't often feel like they work magic, but I think clients felt like we worked some magic over the last couple of years because they were pretty blown away that we were able to win a lot of these. And so I guess walk us through, and again, COVID was sort of an anomaly, but last year we, had success where COVID was less of a factor and there was willingness to consider facts. And I remember one of those cases, there was a lot of issues around like people were a newly enrolled provider. And so there was like delays with the MAC and like getting whatever number you have to get to, submit this stuff or whatever. And so, but tell us some of the things that, go into why you might get one of these letters and what to do about it.
Sure. So what we touched on before, technical difficulties with respect to the acceptance on the government's end of the data that the provider is submitting, right? So you might think, well, we're submitting these every couple weeks. And so therefore, with a 30-day requirement, we're absolutely going to be timely every time. But that's not necessarily the case if you haven't verified that the data was successfully accepted. And then if it's not successfully accepted, successfully troubleshooting that within the 30-day period so that it can be successfully accepted. There have been staffing issues, right, with some of our providers where, the right hand's just not talking to the left hand and thinks, okay, this person's got it. I've assigned them to submit all of the HIS data or all of the CAPS data. And it's just not getting done for one reason or another. We know a lot of providers continue to face staff shortages, even a couple of years out from, what we kind of consider the end of the pandemic. And so that has caused some submissions to not be timely. There are any number of reasons. The new provider example, I think, is a good one as well. The CMS requirement is that as soon as you receive that CCN notification letter, that starts the clock. That starts in terms of your reporting requirement. And so then it's going to be 30 days after each event date. Well, there's oftentimes a difference between the time that you receive that letter and the time that you are technically set up with the capability necessary to submit the data. And
that's
so
like the new provider example, because that gap between the CCN, I got my number, I'm all set to go. And then, getting set up to submit is something totally different.
Exactly.
Well,
Those are all examples of things that can happen that would push your timeliness compliance rate for the calendar year below 90%.
Yeah. And we've learned interesting and really like oddball things as we're working on this. And one of the things was only two people, like there can only be two logins or something. And so like you have someone an employee with a tragic event and then like trying to get that number. I mean, it's just, there's some real limitations in how the system works. And to your point too, because people are working from different locations, like if I know there's been thoughts about, does internet connection like not somehow impact things or whatever? I mean, there's a lot of oddball things that we've run into.
Absolutely. This process is rife with pitfalls such that even the most diligent provider can easily fall below 90% in a given calendar year. And you touched on a couple of them, Meg, one of which is the fact that the government actually only allows each provider to designate two individuals to submit this data on a regular basis. And so that leaves you very little margin for error, right? Because if one of those designated employees quits or suffers a death in the family or becomes ill, or really if anything happens at all, there's only one person left. And if something happens to both of them at the same time, then you're scrambling to get new credentials, from the government's end. And so it really is very easy to have something like this happen. Oftentimes providers come to us and they can't believe it, right? They try to do everything right.
Yeah.
And they generally do things right. So certainly nothing to feel bad about, but definitely something to look for and to act on if you do receive one of these letters.
Well, and as you're talking about the pitfalls, it just makes me think about all these enrollment and deactivation issues we're having, because sometimes you update your enrollment records and then the development request from the government goes to someone's email that hasn't worked at the organization for, some time. I was just on a call with a client recently where this person hasn't worked there for some time, didn't submit the application, but somehow was the one that got the development request. And the way, again, I didn't know that this is how the way things work. Like if you tried to email this person internally, you would get an undeliverable. But if you emailed them from like your personal email address to the organization, you're not getting an undeliverable. Because the first question was like, well, when have the government gotten an undeliverable or something? And it's just like lots of weird stuff. Like it's just like things that are embedded in your profile about where things go and who gets what. And because we've run into issues where you've updated the government with whatever they need. And then somehow their computer system reverts to using some like an address, to your point, from 10 years ago that said, I moved from that location 10 years ago, but that's somehow resurrected in the system. And so anyway, we're dealing with other very difficult situations because with deactivations, your revenue is cut off completely. I mean, 4%, no fun, but like 95% of my revenue just stops because my Medicare number is deactivated because of something went to some old email address or something. I mean, it's just, so when you say rife with pitfalls, these nightmares I'm dealing with clients and deactivations, it just rings very true. So these are arcane systems, but unfortunately, we have to deal with them.
Yeah, they're what we've got. And so there are technical problems, there are submission acceptance problems, there are staffing issues. Certainly during the pandemic, the toll that the illness itself took on hospice staff, combined with the efforts to get people vaccinated, which diverted resources away from such things as government reporting. These are all things that we've been able to weave into the stories that we tell in seeking reconsideration of the payment reduction. The other thing we've been able to add as recently as last year, because that penalty doubled from 2% of the APU to now 4% of the APU, is a good faith financial hardship argument that probably would not have resonated as well back when it was 2%, but certainly at 4%, we've been able to say, look, this could very well be the difference between the hospice's continued service of its community and its inability to operate at all. And we've made that argument again in good faith on behalf of certain providers where the situation warrants.
Yeah, I forgot about that, but you're exactly right. And I do think that CMS has listened in these cases, and it, unlike some other appeal rights where you sometimes feel like it's a rubber stamp, at least over these last 4 years, I feel like they've honestly taken a look at what we're saying and exercising discretion in, I think, a really wonderful way, because people who are trying to comply and you did submit data, I mean, I'm thinking about, EMR conversions and that screws something up, or another thing that's plaguing people is people's median length of stay still hasn't recovered since COVID. And so there are still some hospices that, you know, their median length of stay is like 9 days. So, all these things you're reporting, your volume of the reporting is going up because your census is turning over so quickly. And so, I mean, there's just a lot of things that as you and I have worked on these cases, you discover about how difficult things really are for people, and people are really wanting to comply. It's not like people thumbing their nose at this requirement.
And these are all circumstances that we will help you think about when you consult with us. I mean, so many providers, clients will come to us and they'll say, well, we dropped the ball. We just messed
Yeah.
up. We just
Yeah.
didn't get to 90%.
Yeah.
And we'll probe them a little bit in a good way and say, okay, but what was going on last year, right? What are the real reasons why this happened? Because you're an otherwise compliant provider. You're always trying to do the right thing. So, tell us a little bit about staffing. Tell us a little bit about, technically how this data is submitted and accepted from your end. Tell us what was going on in the community in terms of the COVID burden. Tell us everything that might have led to your falling below 90% for this particular year, so that we can tell the most compelling narrative as to why you deserve to have this payment or this penalty reversed.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like people are like, that's why in my little blurb description for this podcast, the key takeaways are don't assume there's nothing you can do. Because I feel like people fall on their sword when they shouldn't. Like, of course, we're not perfect, right? We're humans. So, like, human stuff happens. So, tell us about that human stuff, because lawyers should be good storytellers, and you're a great storyteller. You're a great litigator, and that's what litigators hopefully can do, is to weave that narrative, as you said. But it is just people are saying like, well, it wasn't perfect. And so anyway, I think you're right, is good lawyers ask good questions, and we found out really meaningful stuff, 20 questions in, and our light bulbs going on like, hey, there's something here that clients maybe felt like they didn't have. So, and don't wait, because I know sometimes when we release this podcast, we get a bunch of phone calls, or sometimes it's like, oh, I just assumed I could do nothing. And then I heard this podcast, 3 weeks later. And so it's been a mad dash the last 4 years to try to get all these in, because we've worked on a lot of appeals. But anyway, try to stay ahead of it. And that's why we're trying to stay ahead of it by doing the podcast like before the letters come out, right? So we're recording this on July 10th, 2024, and we're going to try to release this July 11th, 2024. So I don't know if the letters have come out, but we're trying to catch it early.
Yes. I mean, we have not heard from any clients that have received a letter as of July 10th. CMS's official communication says that they will begin notifying hospices of noncompliance in early to mid-July 2024. In past years, it's usually been more like mid-July than early July. And then typically the deadline to submit a reconsideration request asking for reversal of the 4% payment will be sometime in mid-August. It's usually on whatever that Friday is of mid-August. If I had to bet, it'll be Friday, August 16th this year. But again, we don't have that date with certainty yet. But as Meg said, definitely call us on the front end as soon as possible after receiving one of these letters. The other thing I'll add is this is a multi-layer appeal process if you want it to be. Typically, for most providers, given the amounts at stake versus the cost to litigate, we go through the reconsideration phase only. And another reason we do that is because, as Meg has mentioned, we have had overwhelming success at that phase and have obtained reversals on behalf of the vast majority of clients on whose behalves we've submitted reconsideration requests. But this is not a particularly burdensome or costly phase of appeal. This is not a situation where you're going to end up paying us, anywhere close to the amount that's at stake when it comes to 4% of your APU for the next fiscal year. It really is a modest and fairly open and shut, task for us to perform. We're going to want to talk with you again about the facts and circumstances surrounding the alleged noncompliance. We're going to prepare a letter to CMS on your behalf seeking reconsideration. We're going to collect the documentary evidence that'll support our request. And then we're going to submit it. But it really is a pretty streamlined process that, so don't look at the size of the penalty and say, well, it's probably not even worth getting a lawyer involved. Talk with us, be open with us about the amount at stake. We'll work with you. And again, that initial reconsideration phase where we've had a lot of success, really not too expensive, not too burdensome.
Well, and I guess maybe the final thing that I want to say, it struck me as you're talking, is don't wait. Like, there is a process, and I can't remember the right word, Jake, where you can ask sort of, in advance for a waiver, because let's say you've something did happen and like those can be granted. And we've done that for some people where they felt like they weren't going to be compliant and they proactively asked for grace, essentially.
Yes, you can seek an exemption or an extension with respect to part of the reporting period. In other words, the data that is submitted and accepted outside of the 30-day time frame from the event date, if what's called an extraordinary circumstance befalls the hospice. Now, the term extraordinary circumstance is not all that well defined, which is extremely advantageous to providers, right? Because then we can couch almost anything that may have happened that prevented you from timely submitting data as an extraordinary circumstance. The key is that you need to seek an exemption or extension within 90 days of the extraordinary circumstance event. So if you look over the course of the calendar year, at whatever point your non-compliance with the timeliness requirement ended, right? In other words, when you started submitting data on time again, you'll want to submit that extension or exemption request within 90 days of that time. We find we've had great success with extension and exemption requests as well. And at worst, it gives you a second bite at the apple, right?
Yeah.
You can request the extension or exemption. And if CMS doesn't grant it, then you'll just receive a non-compliance notification in July of the following year. And then we can do a reconsideration request. So it kind of gives you two chances to prevail.
Yeah, who knew, Jake? You were going to become the expert in all of the land on HIS and CAP appeals.
It's a nice little cottage industry we've got.
So, yeah. Anyway, well, I'm so glad that you're here to help. And it's been pretty terrific, the results we've been able to get for folks. So hope no one needs to listen to this podcast, but given what we know, like life happens and humans are humans, that there is probably someone that needs to listen to this. And we are people that can be of service here. So anyway, thanks as always for your time, Jake. And maybe we'll have to do another podcast because we're going to have all these victories again. I don't want to, knock on wood that we'll be successful, but
well, thank you for having me on, Meg, and I hope we are talking about another fresh batch of victories sometime in the fall.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, that's it for today's episode of Hospice Insights, The Law and Beyond. Thank you for joining the conversation. To subscribe to our podcast, visit our website at hushblackwell.com or sign up wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, may the wind be at your back.